The number one artist streamed inside Australia, that is defined as Australian, is, drumroll, The Wiggles. There is some usual suspects that quickly follow. Kid Laroi, who you could argue is a contemporary artist, is in that top 100, as is Akadurka, I think you pronounce it as, the phonetic expression.
ACDC, yeah.
One for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, I'm Ebony Bennett and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. Australia has a remarkable musical legacy. INXS, Kylie Minogue, Akadurka, Amyl and the Sniffers, even the Wiggles. And not only have Australians created incredible music, but lots of our bands are cultural icons at home and abroad.
As the new Prime Minister of Australia, I would like to say all immigrants welcome.
The time has come to say fair's fair, to pay the rent, to pay our share.
Have you always felt the rhythm?
I certainly always liked music.
If people simply get on the beers.
Albert, day before the election, what's an old school banger we can play that we can all sing along to?
There's no better sing-along than Am I Ever Gonna See Your Face Again by the Angels.
The time has come.
The Treasurer's your seat.
The Treasurer's
your seat.
But the future of Australian music is looking increasingly precarious. Too often pubs prioritise pokies over live performance, meaning traditional pathways to success aren't what they used to be. And streaming services really aren't helping like they should. According to new research published by the Australia Institute, streaming numbers for Australian artists are in decline. And while recording industry revenue has increased significantly since 2021, it looks like much less of that money is going to Australian artists who create that music. So what's going on and what can government and the music industry do about it? Joining me today to talk about reversing the decline of Australian music is Will Page, former Spotify chief economist and lead author of this new Australia Institute research. G'day, Will. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening. And
with us also is Will's co-author of the report and Australia Institute research manager, Morgan Harrington. G'day, Morgan.
Hi.
I'm going to start with the headline of the report, Will, which is that in just 4 years, there's been a really big drop in the number of times Australian music is streamed. What did the research find?
Well, the research put some flesh around what was already quite an array of headlines coming out of Australia. Speaking from here in the United Kingdom, we were aware there were problems bubbling down under. And we were seeing these headlines of, why is there no Australian artists in the top 100? Wow, Wipeout was another headline, I think, named after an Australian song, talking about the lack of Australian artists in the end-of-year charts. And those headlines have been bubbling up for a while. So what we did in this study was, from the time periods of 2021 to 2024, capture the top 10,000 artists in Australia and ask how many were Australian. Let's just be clear for the people who listen to the Australian Institute podcast, you're interested in research methodology. The top 10,000 artists captures around 85-90% of all the streams. It's a truly representative sample. Nobody had gone that deep before. So what had happened was that in 2021, there was 962 Australian artists in that top 10,000. So that's less than 1 in 10. By 2024, that had fallen to 766. That's the observation count. That's me counting how many Australian artists do I see. But this is a two-sided chart because it's a two-sided question. Demand is what streams those artists capture. And in 2021, the answer was 12% of all streams went to Australian artists. By 2024, that had fallen by a third to 8%. And that's your problem. Fewer artists capturing less streams in their own domestic market.
That's a pretty big decline in quite a short space of time. What Australian music are people streaming?
So it's a little bit embarrassing for me to say this on the Australian Institute podcast, but the number one artist streamed inside Australia, that is defined as Australian, is, drumroll, The Wiggles. I don't know how your audience feels about that, but it is strange but true. There is some usual suspects that quickly follow. Kid Laroi, who you could argue is a contemporary artist, is in that top 100, as is Akadurka, I think you pronounce it as, so the phonetic expression.
ACDC, yeah.
Who are, by the way, 3/5 Scottish if you look at their ancestral roots, although Australians remind me they escaped Scotland because of the weather. You've also got a band called Hilltop Hoods in there, and Vance Joy. So there are some artists, but only 6 artists of the top 100 were Australian. And that's quite surreal to see a country with such a low local presence at the very, very top of their charts. And most of those artists debuted outside of this decade. I think only Kid Laroi would be considered an artist that came through in the past 10 years.
Yeah. So what does this mean for Aussie bands, Morgan? What kind of picture does this paint for the Australian music scene?
Well, like Will said, the artists that are present in that top 10,000, the ones at the very top are older, better established artists. But what Will was also able to show in his research is that the presence of Australian bands has also dropped out at the bottom end. So we're talking about the top 9,000 to 10,000th streamed band, and the number of Aussies appearing there has gone down. And so what that shows is that bands that are starting up are not getting the traction that they used to get even, a few years ago in 2021. And that's concerning because, well, if they're not getting an audience now, how are they ever going to develop a career into the future?
Yeah, so it's really impairing, I guess, the pipeline of new Australian music coming up from kicking off their careers, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's great that we have AC/DC who are, smashing it still all around Australia on tour very recently. But what's going to happen in the future?
Yeah. So, Will, what's happening here with the streaming services? What's the issue that's, I guess, facilitating this decline?
So here you have to be very careful, and I encourage people who are reading the report to think like a doctor. Look for the symptoms and the cures. And that involves dropping a few of your own biases. The way I approached this was to make quite a striking observation about the plight of Australia. And I have to add, Canada and the United Kingdom are moving in similar directions in terms of the presence of their local artists and their local charts. But on the other side of the street, looking at the success of non-English speaking countries across Europe and Latin America. So the German charts are increasingly dominated by German bands performing in German, ditto the French, ditto the Italian. Denmark was definitely an eye-catching example. There's only 5.3 million people that speak Danish in the world. It's a small country by landmass. It's a small country by language. Swedish people don't understand Danish. And 16 of the top 20 albums in Denmark were Danish bands performing in Danish, and 15 of the top 20 singles were ditto Danish bands performing in Danish. So we call this phenomena globalization, where those in non-English speaking countries seem to be doing incredibly well, brilliantly. Local language artists are dominating their charts. But in English speaking countries which are not American, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing a decline of the local presence. So for the Commonwealth Club, if I'm allowed to call it that, of Canada, Britain and Australia, we're seeing reduced local presence. And that makes you wonder about a lot of things. In the Open Report, we argue, you could look at the streamers, you could look at the record labels, you could look at a concept which I'd never heard of before called tall poppy syndrome, which is defined to me as you have to get big abroad before you're accepted at home in Australia. That's a cultural phenomena way outside of my wheelhouse. But the algorithm was a big one. The algorithm, if I cut a long story very short and put a pin in this one, it can read language, but it can't read maps. It can read that Morgan Harrington is German and likes German rock and queue up lots of German language rock. But if Ebony is Australian and speaks English, it queues up lots of English, let's say rock music, which will predominantly be American. And I think that asymmetry, that distinction, is at least one of the big symptoms which is explaining the decline.
And to me, I think that shows that it's not just a matter of taste. People want to say that it's an open market and people can listen to whatever they want. But as Will's just articulated, the algorithms are giving people music. And so I think it's wrong to suggest simply that Australians have stopped liking Australian music.
So, Will, how do we think about the streaming platforms here?
So we have what I call the four horsemen. That is Spotify, the market leader, YouTube, Apple Music, and Amazon, who are all offering, broadly speaking, the same music to the same listeners for the same price. And they have, different sources of streams, be it your own commute to work playlist, be it human editorial playlists, be it algorithm playlists as well. And we'll get into the algorithms shortly. But I think there's another form of attention going on in Australia that's worth flagging. And it's a universal thing, but in Australia, it's got a twist to it. If you look at the rise of TikTok, it's pretty incredible. By January the 1st, 2020, it had overtaken Spotify for monthly active users in Australia. And by January the 1st, 2021, it had overtaken Instagram. TikTok now is reaching about 12 million Australians. I know this is a hot policy debate for Australians right this very minute. But there's very few countries where you see TikTok so far above Instagram and Spotify. So when we discuss the algorithm, Ebony, we've got to be aware of it's not just the algorithm of the music services, it's the algorithm of the social media services as well. They both have a role to play in this discussion.
I must say, TikTok is where I get all my new music recommendations from. Whatever's trending ends up on my playlist.
On that point there, it's interesting if discovery's happening on TikTok, but the library's happening amongst the Spotify's, Apple's, Amazon's, YouTube's. So if we're discussing discovery of Australian artists, we've got to keep that lens broad to capture social media as well as music services.
We've got, obviously, Morgan, a huge Australian music scene here. And traditionally, I guess, radio stations like Triple J, for example, have played a huge role in fostering up-and-coming new bands and traditionally have found a huge amount of success within Australia. Obviously, I'm more of a Double J listener now, but, I'm thinking about the grand history of, Silverchair and Missy Higgins, and there'd be many more recent bands that fit that mold. But it seems like there is a real gap there where we used to get those suggestions and hear new music through exposure to those stations, but the streaming services aren't necessarily replacing like for like in a way that a station like Triple J dedicated to new Australian music was doing. Would that be kind of accurate, do you think, Morgan?
Well, Triple J in particular has its own self-enforced but nevertheless 40% quota for Australian music. And other Australian radio stations have Australian content requirements, which they adhere to varying degrees, but that's kind of another issue. But the real difference, and I think I'll let Will elaborate on this, is that radio stations are curated by real people, and algorithms are just machines feeding you whatever they think based on, as Will said earlier, all the other people listening in English.
So, Will, are we finding the same problems, as you said, in other Commonwealth countries like the UK, like Canada? Are they facing the same issues that the Australian music scene is?
Yeah, so in the UK, the plight of the British music industry can be summarised by saying that we used to produce global pop stars with every year that passes. Here's an Adele, here's a Coldplay, here's an Oasis, here's a Travis, here's a Snow Patrol. I would argue persuasively that we haven't produced a true global pop star since Dua Lipa in 2017. Let me reframe that for a political podcast. We haven't produced a true global pop star since Brexit. So we have our issues too. Canada, with its 900-pound gorilla just south of its border, has their issues. But joining up the observations of the Commonwealth to this editorial point, if the algorithm is a problem, I truly believe that human curation is a solution. And a lot of other people reading this report have very different opinions. Fix the algorithm. I think what human editorial does is it encourages a one-to-many moment, a communal listening experience, which gives you intimacy. What the algorithm does is gives you many one-to-one moments. So I believe you had a show called Countdown in Australia back in the older years, where people
and
would gather
recovery for
around.
the slightly younger people.
Okay, I'm trying to do my history here. But the point being, all of Australia would gather together around that cultural moment, and you could break music that way. And I don't want to sound nostalgic or retrospective here, but what that allows you to do is to help content stand above the crowd. Now, forget the words radio, it's just how do you get content to stand above the crowd in an age of the algorithm? Now, it seems to be working for some countries where national language is a form of identity. It clearly isn't working for other countries where our language is shared with the great big 900-pound gorilla that is the United States of America. So I think that's where you have that challenge. If the algorithm's a problem, how do you create human editorial, communal listening experiences could be the solution.
The countdown has begun with superstar Taylor Swift due in Australia in the next 48 hours for her sellout tour.
Taylor Swift will take to the stage in a little over 24 hours with 300,000 people flocking to the MCG for 3 massive shows.
More than 25,000 Queenslanders are expected to fly from Brisbane for the tour.
64 additional flights have been scheduled into Melbourne and Sydney over the coming week.
Over the past 2 nights, tens of thousands of fans have been tailgating, as they like to call it, partying right here outside the MCG.
So there is no question, Australians do want more Australian music, or is it that people are really seeking out artists like Taylor Swift, American artists? What do we know about what people want to listen to in Australia?
Well, the great thing with streaming is we get to see how content is actually being consumed. And it's worth just taking a step back. In the age of the CD, this is a very funny story, in the late 90s, early 90s, where record labels during their cocaine capitalism years were at their greatest heights ever, record labels used to sell CDs to record shops by the weight of pallet. I would say to Ebony, I got a pallet of CDs for you. You didn't ask what was inside the pallet, you asked how much did it weigh. And I find that a beautiful moment to think, how much data science is in a pallet of CDs? Not a lot. Now you look at streaming, we get to see how all content's being consumed. And there's a lot more content to choose from. It's an increasingly crowded room, and it's getting harder and harder to speak to the people at the back. So that presents an opportunity. We now know how content is being consumed. But for the Australian market, with its geographical barriers, with its language barriers, as we've now discussed, how do you get that content to stand above the crowd becomes, a very unique, nuanced challenge.
And how difficult is it for streaming services to modify their algorithms to be part of the solution? Because presumably streaming services they always need new artists to be up and coming as well, or do they, are they agnostic? They don't care where bands come from, just as long as there's new music doesn't matter.
They care like everyone else cares. There's no villain in this community. Everybody's trying to pull the same plough in the same direction. It just for Australia clearly isn't working out. But one suggestion I put forward in the report is to take a look at Triple J. And I have to say, whinging about Triple J is now a national pastime in Australia. Even greater than whinging about the All Blacks beating you in the rugby. But it's still there. It still has a role. So why doesn't Triple J work with the streaming services as opposed to on separate sides of the same street? Why don't you grow each other's gardens, as we say in Scotland? And I think there's an opportunity there to take the human editorial, what's the word I'm looking for, credibility that the public sector broadcasters and radio brings, and help that work with the streaming services. And the example I threw out there was a radio station in Santa Monica, California called KCRW, which doesn't just link their playlist directly into Spotify and Apple Music, so you can listen in a communal setting and go straight to your playlist and add it, but they're now live streaming on YouTube, allowing for comments, likes, and feedback features. That's a radio station working with the future, not against the future. And I think that, just to throw a seed and maybe it will take root, I think that's a potential solution for Australia to explore over the short term.
And just to offer a contrast to that, if you want to listen to any ABC audio content, you have to go through the ABC Listen app. And that's quite different. That's a different way of accessing the music. And if we're trying to get more people to listen to more Australian content, you want to make it as available as possible.
You can take a horse to water, or you can take water to the horse. And I think what we're discussing here is take radio to where the audiences are.
And Morgan, how does the rest of the industry and I guess artists and themselves think about this problem? Are they, obviously lots of people would have lots of different solutions. Will's talked about kind of more curated playlists and working with existing radio stations. Are there other solutions that people are pushing forward in terms of policy responses?
So the music industry has known about these problems for years, and there's a lot of different solutions floating around. They include changing the way that content requirements work for local radio so that more Australian content is played and so that Aussie artists get more money for when they are played on the radio. There's also suggestions to offer tax incentives to venues that host live music so that more places put on more bands, which gives them more of a platform. And there's also Michael's rule, or the idea that if you're a big international artist touring Australia, you should take an Aussie support act with you so that they get the exposure nationally. Earlier in the year, ARIA reformed the way that they do the Aussie charts, and that's partly to weed out songs that are just always popular on streaming services, which sort of distort the picture of what's new and what's popular amongst the new music to try and give that a bit of a boost.
So presumably that's weeding out the Wiggles constantly, who are on a loop in any household with young children, but not necessarily people's favourite music to listen to.
Well, you talked about going from Triple J to Double J. I think we all grow out of the Wiggles at some point in our life. But yeah, I was talking about weeding out all songs from the charts. I was last in Australia in 2014 when Vance Joy Riptide was absolutely soaring up the charts. And I think up until they changed in the charts, Vance Joy's Riptide was still in the charts up until 2025 as well. If I can flip it to just the other sort of suggestion I put forward in the report, I'm thinking here about practical suggestions, stuff. I mean, I'm sitting here on the other side of the world in a completely different time zone, but what can Australia actually do now that might help reverse the decline? And remember, the first word of the report is reverse. This is not a woe and me report. This is how do we stop the rot? How do we turn the tide in this situation? But it's to look to Canada. Now, Canada does so much of its music industry. There's so much intervention, support, initiatives happening in Canada. Some of it works. Some of it, quite frankly, is bonkers, but you can learn from that stuff. And the suggestion I took from Canada here was to recognise the geographic disadvantage Australian artists face when touring. I calculated that you're probably 100,000 Aussie dollars down for a typical band before you load up the tour bus and travel abroad. Cost of visas, freight, transportation, the exchange rate especially. It's not an easy time for Australian bands to tour. So how do you support that? So a very quick snapshot of this, what Canada does, it says, if you can confirm you've got, let's say, 15 dates abroad in Europe, well, you're a serious band. You've got tour support, you've got insurance, you're committed. So they support every additional date while you're out there. Now imagine how that could work for an Australian band. You commit to, say, 10, 15 dates in Europe, and while you're over there, every additional date you can grab, the Australian government, through Music Australia, would subsidise. You've gone all the way up to Glasgow? Well, get yourself a gig in Edinburgh. I can't afford it. Now you can. 15-date tours becomes 30-date tours. That gets to you more exposure and then to more festival bookings the following year. That, for me, is all good and well. But what I loved about bringing that idea to the Australian Institute is it does what you guys do best. It's what you said at the very start, Ebony. In plain English, what does that do? It marries sunk cost, the cost of getting that tour bus out on the road, marginal cost, the cost of every day you're on the road and every tour date you pick up, and marginal benefit. And that model in Canada really works. And you know how I can say it really works? Because we always looked at festival posters and we see more Canadian bands than American ones. I always thought there's the proof of the pudding. So a brilliant marriage of sunk cost, marginal benefit, wrapped up to help more Australian bands perform to more audiences outside. And that ticks the box of tall poppy syndrome as well.
I think it's important to note, though, that Music Australia does have grants available for some kind of tour support, including for the export market, as well as APRA AMCOS's call for subsidies for live venues in Australia that host, like any kind of venue that decides to put on live music should be incentivized to do so, because that will encourage more people to host more gigs, which should help increase the popularity of Australian music.
And obviously music venues across the country have come through a really rough period with COVID and the collapse of lots of live entertainment, music probably being number one there. So we've talked about, obviously, the 20% decline in the number of artists streamed in Australia. We've talked about, you know, the number of times an Australian band, you know, has been streamed being, you know, declining as well. Can we talk about revenue for a second? Because I can imagine that if we're seeing these problems in streaming music and the recommendations of Australian artists being streamed in decline. That must impact on revenue as well. We've talked about the issues with the live music scene. What did we find about the picture of revenue from Australian music in this report, Will?
Record label revenues in Australia have gone from around about 420 million American dollars in 2021 and grown by 25% to $535 million by 2024. That's incredible. Very few established Western markets can report that level of growth. But as I said at the start, the share that's going to Australian artists has fallen from 12% to 8%. So that's a decline in absolute and relative terms. The Australian music industry is making more and more money, but less and less of it is staying in Australia.
So does that basically mean that fewer bands are making it huge, but overall the decline means, most bands aren't getting much at all?
Yeah, so you've got a situation where the majority of the money coming into the Australian music industry from its domestic subscribers and ad-funded revenues is leaving to go to the head offices of record labels elsewhere. Let's just be clear, like $50 million out of a $420 million business is a pretty small share to go to Australian artists, but that's shrinking in absolute and real terms. And that's the gap that your audience needs to understand. That's when you really need to sort of flag the policy consequences here of a booming business, but less of it going back to the domestic market.
So, Morgan, music is one issue, but there are problems with funding of the arts, I guess, right across Australia. How can the government do a better job of supporting the entire kind of arts sector, which we know contributes a huge amount to the economy? It employs a lot of people. It's a real powerhouse of the economy, but it's doing it tough at the moment. What can government do?
Well, look, we've touched on a range of possible initiatives that could help improve the lot of Australian music, but the common denominator is that they all need better funding. Now, Australia's arts funding is amongst the lowest in the developed world, and if we brought it into line with the average, we'd have an extra $5 billion a year to spend on the arts in Australia, and that would be an absolute game changer.
Yeah, $5 billion a year, that's not a small amount of money. If that's the average and that's what we're missing out on every year, you can see why there's so much of a struggle.
Well, imagine the fun we could have with that kind of money. And we were fortunate enough to have former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull write a foreword to our paper. And he points out that creativity is a strategic asset. Just as we invest in technology, energy, and defense, we must invest in culture. Because, as he says, identity is the foundation of confidence. And I think basically what that means is if we want to see ourselves represented, if we want to know who we are as our nation, then we have to invest in it.
Absolutely. And I think, I have to apologize for being a Double J listener who doesn't keep up with all the latest. I've aged out, as Will said before, of Triple J. But, in my experience, Australians really do back our own arts and culture. And we traditionally have loved going to see live music. And I think we get really excited as the reverse of tall poppy that Will was talking about when Australian bands and cultural products make it big internationally, like Bluey, for example, out of the ABC, or Amel and the Sniffers doing so well internationally. Everyone gets a lot of joy out of that as well. But yeah, to think that whoever the next Amel and the Sniffers are, might be really struggling and never make it at the moment. It's a really sad thought. And one, as this report points out, that's not at all inevitable. There's lots of stuff that we can do to send things in a direction of growth.
Yeah, and look, I think it really comes back to community. I mean, I can think of all the great times I've had seeing live music, listening to live music, talking about music with my friends. And I think the reason that this really gets under people's skin is because it's really sad to think that other younger people might not have these experiences.
Yeah, and Will, music is so deeply connected to, it's deeply personal. Going to experience live music is often some of the greatest memories of your life. People listen to their favourite bands and albums over and over and over again. It's really deeply connected and intertwines with people's lives. I guess that's why people care so much about fixing these issues. Is there anything else you would like people to think about who care about Australian music and want to fix these problems?
Well, you're right to stress how much people care, and this is why it's such an emotional subject. And you're treading on eggshells with this policy paper. There's a lot of emotions at stake, but if I can quote a Kiwi, if that's allowed on the Australian Institute podcast.
Always, we'll
Neil
just claim they're
Finn.
Aussie later.
Well, bizarrely, I'm going to quote Neil Finn, who, according to the data, is Australian because 3/4 of his band are Australian. So you've grabbed him just like you grabbed Colin Hay and Jimmy Barnes from Scotland. But yeah, Neil Finn like always, has this beautiful expression where he says, "Music is the alchemy in the room that draws us all together." And I always love that line. The people you meet through music are just incredible. We could all be civil engineers and talk concrete. That's fine. But we're not. We're in music, and I get to meet Ebony and Morgan and work on this paper with you guys. And that's why it's an emotional subject, because it really matters. And to stress, the numbers have to matter too. I mean, I'm so grateful to Malcolm Turnbull for the forward. I love that line, "Decline is not destiny." There's 4 words. You don't need to read my gobbledygook. Just read those 4 words. You can do something to turn this around. The numbers do matter. Going back to Canada, if you were to compare what Australia's put aside for its music industry investment, it's exciting. Music Australia, great team, some great ideas. Hopefully this report helps flesh those ideas out in economic language as well. But that's still about 1/4 of what Canada gives Factor, which is just one of an array of music support mechanisms. And Canada's a pretty comparable country to Australia with far less geographical costs. A band in Vancouver touring Seattle is not the same thing as a band in Brisbane trying to get to Glasgow.
Yeah.
So just to stress there, the money that the government's willing to put in at present is still 1/4 off what a couple of programs in Canada are worth to the Canadian music industry. So, it's exciting, this momentum. We've now got the report out. We now know the state that we're in. I like to quote Upton Sinclair, who said the hardest thing is explaining to a man he has a problem when his job depends on him not understanding it. We now understand the problem, but the first word of this report is reverse. I want to try and help Australia reverse that problem. And it can be done, but you got to pull the same plough together here. It needs some joined up thinking.
Just while we're talking about how deeply personal music is, Will, you have quoted my favourite Australian band, which is Crowded House, who I've seen a number of times live, and alchemy is definitely the right word for their stage presence. And I was just thinking then after COVID, after all the lockdowns we had here in Australia, Crowded House was the very first band that I saw live and in person again. They were absolutely magic, and everyone in that theatre could not have been more happy to be there. Everyone sang every single word to every single song, and it was such a beautiful moment of community after so long feeling isolated from so many people. And I believe they're touring again early in the new year, coming to Bondi. So I should ask you all before we go, who are you listening to at the moment, Will?
From Australia, that's not INXS, which has been my Spotify rap since 2015. I found this artist called Imi Owusu, who's originally from Ghana, now based in Australia, doing the music that I love, jazz, funk, rap, soul, world music, but the song Right With No Wrong. Put your listeners onto that one. Add that to your queue. Gritty, funky, but he sings with heart, man. He sings with heart. He brings the fire.
Excellent.
I had the good fortune of going to the Thirroul Music Festival last weekend, little grassroots festival, which I loved. And I had the pleasure of seeing Romy Vega from RVG perform solo. And she played new music from a forthcoming album, which I'm really looking forward to. And if you're at all into The Cure or The Smiths or that kind of post-punk stuff, check out RVG. They're fantastic.
Sounds absolutely wonderful. And I will just take those on, and I have no recommendations of my own because I'm old and I no longer hear new music. So I rely on other people's recommendations. On that happy note, we'll wrap it up there. And thank you so much, Will and Morgan, for your time. And hopefully we'll speak to you again soon when we've helped reverse this trend for Australian music.
Thanks, Ebony.
Our latest book from Australia Institute Press is called A Time for Bravery, What Happens When Australia Chooses Courage, and it's available now. Usually $35.99. For a limited time only, you can save $5 off our latest book with the code POD5. You can order now from australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link in our show notes. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 2nd of December, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.